All right, welcome to Evolutionary Psychology. This is the first lecture. Today, what I'll be doing is introducing the basic ideas behind evolutionary psychology, and I'll continue this discussion in the second lecture. Our focus today, though, is going to be really understanding evolutionary theory in general, and then we'll start applying it to the mind in the following lectures. All right, so in general, what is evolutionary psychology? Right, so the field really begins with the assumption that the mind is a machine. It shares that idea with a lot of other approaches to psychology. But it says that it's a particular kind of machine, right? A machine that emerged through the forge of the problems that our ancestors faced. Right, so the idea is that the mind arose in response to certain challenges, certain adaptive problems. So evolutionary psychology says that you need to understand what those adaptive problems are, because the mind is a set of tools that evolved to help our ancestors solve those problems. So adaptive problems are problems that are long-standing, that a species has to solve in order to survive and reproduce. So challenges that are around for only a single generation, for example, wouldn't be an adaptive problem. Right? These are things that have to be present, recurrent for many, many years. So things like weather conditions, the food that's around for a species, or the lack thereof, right? Those are challenges that are recurrent that species have to evolve and acquire characteristics to deal with. So for evolutionary psychology, the adaptive problems that are relevant are ones that require a species, such as ourselves, to process information from the environment, right? Ones that require a nervous system to emerge in order to deal with those problems. So this includes things like finding a suitable mating partner, right? We have to be good at figuring out who is a viable mate, who's going to help us to produce copies of our genes for the next generation. Obviously, we don't think in those terms, but that's the bottom line for evolution, right? Making copies of our DNA. So this involves, or this requires that we scan the environment for information and pick out important pieces of information that are embedded in the environment. This also applies to things like figuring out what we can eat, right? That requires scanning the environment for certain cues, detecting those cues, processing them, and then carrying out some actions in the world. All right, so there's lots of information processing adaptive problems that we have to solve, especially as we emerged, as we evolved as hunters and gatherers, right? That has its own unique challenges that we have to deal with. So an interesting thing about evolutionary psychology is that it has a lot to say about our emotional lives, why we feel the way that we do about certain things, why certain things delight us and why certain things disgust us. So it has a lot to say, for example, about what it is that we find beautiful. So why do certain landscapes, for example, move us? Why do they intrigue us? Why do they motivate us to explore them? Right? Why do they draw us in? Right? And it also has to do with what we find beautiful in other people. And traditional psychologists like to think that what we find beautiful is purely arbitrary and completely culturally dependent. Now, I'm not going to say that there are no cultural aspects to beauty, but I do want to argue, along with evolutionary psychology, that there are at least some aspects of beauty, certain aspects of what we find beautiful in other people that are universal and reveal our evolved nature. So for example, as we'll see, there is a lot of cultural variability in terms of how much weight is preferred in a partner, right? So some cultures like people to be heavier, others thinner. But one thing that is pretty constant is a preference in women, or about women, for small waist to hip ratios. Right? Men tend to prefer women with a small waist to hip ratio. That's the ratio of the waist at the narrowest point to the hips at the broadest point. So typical cultural psychologists would say that that's purely arbitrary, right? But what we find is that despite these variations in overall weight, there is universally a preference for women with small waist to hip ratios. And there's a preference for men with larger waist to hip ratios. So why would men in general tend to prefer women with small waist to hip ratios? And the reason is quite simple from an evolutionary perspective, because the waist to hip ratio tracks fertility. Women with smaller waist to hip ratios tend to have more estrogen, and they tend to be more fertile, and they tend to be younger. So it tracks fertility. Now that's just one example, right, of things that attract us. Other examples of beauty involve, for example, in women, fuller lips, narrower jaws, bigger eyes. And these are signals of high levels of estrogen and low levels of testosterone, right, also related to fertility in women. And as far as men are concerned, broader jaws, broader nose, things like that are signs of high levels of testosterone, which is also evolutionarily important for men. Right, so these emotional reactions that we have, these attractions that we have, evolutionary psychologists say that we can explain them by looking at evolutionary factors. Factors having to do with the need to solve important adaptive problems. All right, so what is evolutionary psychology? It's a view of the mind which says that the mind is made up of a large number of adaptations, a lot of machinery that arose in response to certain recurrent pressures that our ancestors faced. Right? So one of the things that were recurrent is the need to find fertile mates. And that's a constant pressure, and that led to the evolution of certain sex preferences of men and women. So another way of saying this is that evolutionary psychology applies Darwinian or adaptationist thinking to explain a lot of the psychological phenomena that we see in people around the world. Now, I would like to point out that Darwin didn't mean to exclude psychology from an evolutionary approach, even though he actually has very little to say about psychology, at least in his book, Origin of Species. He does talk about it in other books, like his book on the expression of emotions in animals and man, and the descent of man. There he also talks about language. But in Origin of Species, he has very little to say about psychology. But he does, at the very end, he does point out that evolutionary thinking is relevant to psychology. Right, so he says, in the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power by gradation, right, by a gradual process of evolution. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Right, so evolutionary psychology really takes this as its main cause to apply Darwinian thinking to psychology and human nature. Now, when we're talking about evolution, we really need to keep in mind that there's two different claims, right? Two different kinds of evolutionary claims. One is the descriptive claim that species have evolved, that species have changed over time. Right, so this is the idea that species aren't static, they change, the biological world is a moving target. And this is different from the explanatory claim about what causes these species to change. Okay, so one is the fact of evolution, and the other is an explanation for what causes evolution. So I want to explain both of these claims, and I want to talk about Darwin's contribution. So let's begin with common descent, right? The fact of evolution. This is also referred to as descent with modification. The idea that our progeny are slightly different from ourselves, and that gets carried on through history. Right, so the fact of evolution, of common descent, is the idea that species have changed over time from a common ancestor, so that they're not static. Now this idea is not Darwin's, right? Although he did provide a lot of support for it, this wasn't his idea, right? It had been around long before. Even ancient Greek philosophers, like Anaximander, for example, had evolutionary ideas. And the Roman philosopher Lucretius also had evolutionary ideas, stating that all living things were related and that they had changed through time. Now, this idea is something that flies in the face of a lot of religious claims, right? In particular, the idea of common descent clashes with creationism, because creationism is precisely the claim that species are static and been the same form, the same framework over time. Right, so as far as common descent is concerned, the idea is that Darwin talked about, although it wasn't his original idea. He says that life started out with a single life form, or at least a few life forms, and that these changed over billions of years into the various forms of life that we see around us. Now, obviously, most of the creatures that have existed are no longer in existence, right? Extinction is the rule. Everything dies off eventually, right? And about 99% of the species that have existed are no longer present. But regardless, everything that is alive today and that has ever existed is ultimately related through common descent, through descent with modification. Right, so as a result of that, all the creatures that have ever existed can be represented on what Darwin called the tree of life. Right, so here it's represented with the Earth having been formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Then, for a long time, the Earth was incapable of sustaining any form of carbon-based life. But about 3.5 billion years ago, we start to see the evolution of self-replicating entities, things that are capable of copying themselves, which eventually evolved into prokaryotes, which I'll talk about momentarily. And then for a couple billion years, we have the evolution of these prokaryotes. Eventually, we get the eukaryotic revolution. And then about 700 million years ago, we start to see the evolution of multi-celled organisms, and from there we see the evolution of plants and animals and everything else that we seem to care about. So the tree of life is more accurately represented with something like this, because it shows much more complexity here. And what you can see here is all the different kinds of creatures, right? From bacteria, eukaryotes, we have fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. And you can see on the bottom right where humans are in this vast panoply of life. And so really I like this because it shows a lot of the complexity, and it shows that we are just one tiny little branch in this incredibly complex bush. But that regardless of all this complexity, you can ultimately trace everything to some common ancestor that existed about 3.5 billion years ago. All right, so as I said, prokaryotes are among the earliest living organisms. So they're single-celled, and examples include blue-green algae and many kinds of bacteria. And what distinguishes them from other life forms is that what they lack is a true cell nucleus, right? That doesn't evolve until much later. Right, so about 1.4 billion years ago, we have the evolution of eukaryotes. Initially, these are also single-celled, but they have a complex cell nucleus. And examples here include certain types of fungus. And then, as I said, 700 million years ago, we have multi-celled organisms, which eventually leads to plants and animals. Now, what kinds of evidence is there for common descent? What evidence suggests that species are related to each other? And these are arguments that you can give against creationist kinds of views. Right, the first is what are called homologies. If you look, right, with a keen eye at living creatures, you see some remarkable resemblances, right, some remarkable similarities. And some of these similarities are too odd to simply be chance, right? There's no good reason for them to have the similarity unless they are related through common descent, unless there was some common ancestor that split off in different directions, but carried through some of those characteristics in each branch. Right, so these are homologies, similarities between species that make the most sense on the assumption that the species had a common ancestor. So the 5 digits in the human hand and actually the forearm, right, can be seen in different form. You can see it being modified in different species. Right, so here we have a representation of 6 different bones, for example, types of bones. We have the human hand there and the human forearm, and you can see those bones in a slightly different and modified form in the wing of the bat, right? So, and in other creatures as well. So there's a common ancestor that had some version of these bones, and it's been modified for these different species, right? So there's no reason for why you should see these similarities other than the fact that they have a common ancestor. Now, although Darwin didn't have this information available, right, genetic evidence also provides evidence for common descent. Right, so, for example, humans and chimpanzees are so closely related genetically that it makes sense to refer to humans as a type of chimpanzee. Right, so humans and chimps share about 98% of their DNA. And based on the rate of change, the rate of mutations, it's estimated that we had a common ancestor with the chimpanzees about 5 to 6 million years ago. And that's why we see, when we look at chimpanzees, as you will, we can see some remarkable similarities between humans and chimpanzees. But if you want to study evolution from a genetic perspective, the best place to look is with viruses, right? Viruses, although they're not strictly speaking living things because they don't replicate themselves, they rather co-opt the replication machinery of other animals. They do show that they are subject to natural selection, and they are subject to descent with modification. So a great book on this talks about the AIDS virus, and it shows that the genetic samples of the virus originally obtained in the early 80s are very different from more recent versions of the virus. Right? We know, for example, that there's 2 main subtypes of the AIDS virus, and even within these there's various versions of those subtypes. Okay, and we know that the virus is constantly changing, right? It's constantly adapting itself to the defenses, to the various drugs that are used to treat it, and also to the sexual habits of the society in which it lives. We know, for example, that in a society where there's a lot more promiscuity, right? The AIDS virus is much more virulent. It's much more deadly. But when the society is more restrained sexually, the virus evolves to be less virulent, and that's because it has to. If it's gonna reproduce, it has to keep the host alive long enough for it to find a suitable um, opportunity for reproducing. A third source of evidence for common descent comes from fossil evidence, right? When we dig up fossils in different layers, we can see descent with modification, right? We see that the older fossils are very different from more recent fossils, and older fossils of hominids are more different from modern humans than those fossils of more recent ancestors. And on this figure here, you can see one of our ancestors from about 3.5 million years ago, the Australopithecus afarensis, right? Its skeleton, its bone structure is very different, is more different from us than the skeleton of Homo erectus, a more recent ancestor. And finally, there's vestigial structures, right? Structures that are present in creatures that no longer seem to serve a function. Right? Stephen Jay Gould, wonderful evolutionary biologist, refers to these vestigial structures as the senseless signs of history. Right, so he says that the best evidence for evolution isn't good design. It isn't pointing out things that are well functioning. It's looking at an organism and finding all those things that don't make any sense from an engineering perspective. Right, so he says these are the senseless signs of history. So for example, humans, at the tip of the tailbone, we have the remnants of a tail. We also have organs like the appendix, which at least for many years was believed to be vestigial. Although there's some debate on that issue now, that it may play a role in immune functioning. But we also have vestigial genes for producing vitamin C. The idea here is that at some point in our evolutionary history, we stopped metabolizing our own vitamin C, and we started to rely on external sources of vitamin C like fruit. But we still have the genes that are responsible for producing those structures, right, that are present in other animals. Right? In us, we have those genes, but they don't have any effect. Right? They don't produce anything. And perhaps my favorite example is that birds have genes for the production of teeth. Right? Birds, the descendants of dinosaurs, right, evolved to not have any teeth showing, but they have genes for the production of teeth. And with the right stimulus during development, you can actually stimulate the production of teeth by activating those genes. Right, so these are the senseless signs of history. Signs that show that the creatures that we see around us, including ourselves, have a long evolutionary history, and we carry that history with us in our bodies. Now, as I said, there's two claims about evolution. One is common descent, not Darwin's idea, although he did find support for it. Darwin's most important contribution was with respect to the second claim about evolution, which is an explanation of how evolution happens, an explanation of what drives it, and this is the idea of natural selection. Right, so Darwin began with the ideas of Thomas Malthus, who wrote a book called An Essay on the Principles of Population. And what Malthus pointed out is that populations of animals tend to grow at a much higher rate than the resources available to support them. Right, so if you imagine elephants, for example, imagine two of them reproducing and then their offspring reproducing, producing copies of themselves, and those producing copies of themselves. If there's no checks on the population, very quickly the population will explode and put a lot of pressure on the resources of food to supply them. Right? So this is important because it implies that one of the most basic facts of life is a competition for limited resources, right? Competition for limited resources. And quite often this competition is most severe between members of the same species. Why would that be? Because members of the same species want the same things. Right? Members of different species quite often make a living by exploiting different resources. Right, so this is an important principle because it really lays the foundation for natural selection. So let me now talk about the components of natural selection, what's required for natural selection to take place. The first component is variation, right? So individuals within a species have to vary in all sorts of ways, right? And this is important because it's variation that provides the raw materials for evolution. So if you think about thickness of a coat of fur on an animal, right? Some animals, some members of a species are going to have a slightly thicker coat than others, right? If they all had the same thickness of coat, then there would be nothing for natural selection to work on. Other examples of variation for people: some people are smarter, some people are faster, some people are more aggressive, some people are kinder, some people are more attractive. There's all kinds of variance, and evolution works by exploiting this variance, by using this variance to guide the species in certain directions. The second component of natural selection is inheritance. Right, so not all variations are relevant for evolution by natural selection. The traits that are important are those that can be passed on through reproduction. Right, they can be inherited by offspring from their parents. So this rules out certain acquired characteristics, right, which Lamarck said, right? So according to Lamarck, if a creature acquired certain traits during its lifetime, it could pass those on directly to its offspring. That's not natural selection, right? So if you lose a limb, for example, right, that's an acquired characteristic. That's not going to be passed on to your offspring. Right. The third and very important component of natural selection is selection. Right? Traits that give an organism an edge in survival are the ones that are selected for. Right. So this means that the environment is what determines which variations are beneficial and which are not. So is a thick coat of fur adaptive? Right? It depends on the environment. Right? If it's a cold environment, it may be adaptive. If it's a hot environment, it may not be adaptive. Right? So, and this is what makes evolution by natural selection such a non-random process, because people often object to evolution by saying, how could a purely random process produce such complicated structures? Well, what they fail to understand is that in many important respects, evolution is not a random process. Variation is a random process, right? The variants that are generated in any given generation is random. But what's not random is selection, right? The environment places very strong selection constraints on what can survive and reproduce in a particular environment. Right? So natural selection leads to differential reproduction. And this is really the bottom line for evolution by natural selection: differential reproduction. This is the idea that in any given generation, some members of a species are going to produce more offspring than others. Right? And it's those that have the more of that beneficial characteristic that are going to be more likely to reproduce. Right? They're going to leave more copies of their genes behind. And if this is carried on through time, then the species is going to change in that direction. So that with enough differential reproduction, the beneficial trait or characteristic is going to become part of the species as a whole, or at least an important subtype. Now, I have this claim about an important subtype because sometimes a trait isn't spread to everyone in the population. For example, traits that are linked with being female or traits that are linked with being male may evolve by natural selection, but obviously they won't be part of all the organisms, only males or females. Now, I also want to clarify that there's two very different types of inherited traits. Traits for survival and traits for attracting mates, or traits for reproduction. So let's talk a little bit about traits for survival, right? Evolution doesn't really care about survival per se, right? It only cares about survival insofar as it increases the chances of reproduction. So examples of traits that allow for survival or promote survival include things like sweat glands, preferences, taste preferences for certain types of food, right? So sweat glands, what do they help to do? They help to regulate the temperature of the body so that your organs don't overheat. And they work by releasing moisture from the pores onto the surface of the skin. This absorbs heat, and the wind carries that heat away from the body. Right, so these are produced by natural selection. But there's also traits for attracting mates. Right, so what are examples? Elaborate bird song, the peacock's tail. Right, these are extravagant features that creatures have. And some people have argued that our braininess, right? Jeffrey Miller has argued that our incredible intelligence is far more than we need to survive in the environment. It's used for courtship. But the point is that these traits for attracting mates are produced by sexual selection, right? Which is a slightly different mechanism, right? So sexual selection, this is when the mating preferences of one sex affects the characteristics of the other sex. So why do peacocks have such an extravagant tail? Because peahens dig a really big, extravagant tail. So if peahens prefer a slightly larger than average tail, right, what's going to happen to the peacock's tail? Every generation, the male that has the larger tail is going to produce more mates. So very, very quickly, you're going to have this runaway sexual selection where you get this very extravagant tail. And what's important is that natural selection and sexual selection can conflict with each other, right? Because what happens with this peacock is that by having this extravagant tail, it attracts mates, but at the same time, it makes it more likely that it will be captured by predators. Right, so natural selection can help to put a brake on some of these traits that are selected by sexual selection. All right, now I want to end with some more recent developments in evolutionary theory, which are also going to be important for understanding the material of this course. One important development since Darwin is that we have a much better understanding of inheritance. Right? So Darwin didn't really understand how inheritance worked. He didn't understand how traits of male and female are combined to produce offspring. He thought that they were a blend of the two. Right? So he also couldn't explain how mutations arise. Right? So basically what he was lacking is the concept of a gene that was contributed by Gregor Mendel. So a gene is the smallest discrete unit that's inherited by offspring from their parents, right? So from a DNA perspective is the smallest unit of a strand of DNA that has some kind of biological role. Right, so we can distinguish the genotype from the phenotype. Right? The genotype is the entire collection of genes that are possessed by an organism. Right, 50% comes from the mothers. In sexually reproducing species, 50% comes from mothers, 50% from fathers. So we may have genes for blue eyes and genes from brown eyes. We may inherit both, one from our mother, one from our father. But that's different from what is expressed, and that's the phenotype. Right? So the phenotype is the various traits and characteristics that make up our bodies and our minds. So for example, although we may have genes for blue eyes and genes for brown eyes, we only express one, and that's brown eyes in our phenotype. So through the production of gametes, through the production of sex cells, which then fuse with the gametes of the other individual, right, and copying the genetic information to create those gametes, errors sometimes happen. Right? There's errors in the replication of the DNA or RNA. And these copying errors in genetic information are referred to as mutations. Now, these mutations are usually bad, but they can lead to a change in the phenotype, in what is actually expressed. Sometimes they're good and they lead to the favorable variations. Okay? But this unification of natural selection with the theory of genes is what's called the modern synthesis in evolutionary biology. Right? It's a very powerful synthesis that helps us to explain a lot more than Darwin could explain. And another very important, more recent development is that our concept of fitness has been refined. Right? So Darwin viewed fitness as a largely individual affair, but William Hamilton developed the concept of inclusive fitness theory. Right? So he says that if you think about evolution, right, what it really is about is the differential reproduction of genes in a population. Right? A population being a set of interbreeding individuals. And then the question becomes, well, what increases the chances of genes becoming more common in a population or less common in a population? Now, Hamilton says that there's actually two ways for genes to become widespread in a population. One is what we can call classical fitness or Darwinian fitness. And this is by the individual himself or herself producing lots of copies of his genes, right? So mating with lots of individuals. But there's another way, right? And this is the idea behind inclusive fitness. Right, so inclusive fitness is an organism's overall ability to increase the frequency of its genes, either by directly reproducing or by helping out its genetic relatives who also carry its genes. Right, so if we help out our genetic relatives, we're also helping to increase the probability of our genes making it to the next generation. Why? Because our relatives carry our genes. And the closer they are related to us, the more likely they are to carry our genes. And why is this important? Because one thing that Darwin couldn't really explain very well is why it is that we see many animals, including ourselves, make sacrifices for those with whom we're related. Right? So he couldn't explain a lot of this kind of behavior. This was perplexing to him. So by taking an inclusive fitness perspective, we're able to explain a lot more, but still be consistent with Darwinian natural selection. Thank you.